The Woman Who Received Her Own Obituary, a Miss Marple Mystery. Hi there, welcome back to Haunting Vales. Tonight's mystery begins when a woman receives a newspaper obituary announcing her own death. Miss Marple soon realizes this impossible mistake may be the first clue to a carefully planned crime. Before we uncover who wrote the obituary and why, don't forget to subscribe for more haunting Miss Marple mysteries on Haunting Vales. Chapter 1. The Obituary. Rain had been falling over St. Mary Mead since early morning. By 9 o'clock, the little lanes were shining beneath the grey sky, and the little shops were beginning to fill with the smell of tea and warm bread. At the corner newsagent, Mrs. Bell was sorting the morning papers when a folded sheet slipped from one of them. She opened it, glanced at the first paragraph, and froze. It was an obituary for Eleanor Ashcombe, aged 56, of Ashcombe House. It described her charitable work, her late husband, and the rose garden she had tended for years. There was only one problem. Eleanor Ashcombe was alive. She had been seen in the village the previous afternoon. By 10 o'clock, the strange obituary had reached Miss Marple. Inspector Harris placed it on her table and sighed. "Someone has written Mrs. Ashcombe's obituary before she's died." Miss Marple adjusted her glasses and studied the page. "How confident of them." Harris frowned. "You think it's a threat?" "Possibly, but I think it's meant for Eleanor herself." She tapped a paragraph with one finger. It mentioned her husband, Edward Ashcombe, who had died 20 years earlier. "Why include this?" Harris asked. Miss Marple looked at him. "Because whoever wrote it wants her to remember something." Eleanor arrived that afternoon. She was a dignified woman with silvering hair and a firm manner, but the moment she saw the obituary, her face changed. "This is ridiculous," she said. Harris asked whether anyone had threatened her recently. "No," the answer came too quickly. Miss Marple noticed. "Are you quite certain?" Eleanor lowered her eyes. "There are things from the past I'd rather leave alone." Miss Marple gave a small smile. "The past rarely agrees to that arrangement." That evening, Eleanor returned to Ashcombe House. Her nephew Daniel was waiting in the drawing-room with Mrs. Pike, the housekeeper. The obituary lay between them. Mrs. Pike stared at the handwriting. "I've seen this before," she said quietly. Eleanor looked at her. "Where?" Before Mrs. Pike could answer, the telephone rang. She picked it up. There was silence. Then a low voice spoke. "Tell Eleanor the grave is waiting." The line went dead. Later, Eleanor went upstairs. She opened a drawer beside her bed and removed an old photograph of her husband. She stared at it for several seconds. "Not again," she whispered. Then 3 slow knocks sounded downstairs. Eleanor froze. She waited. Nothing followed. At 11:47, the telephone rang again. Mrs. Pike answered, but nobody spoke. The next morning, Eleanor was gone. Her bed had never been slept in. Her dressing gown was hanging neatly beside the wardrobe. Her shoes were still beneath the chair, and the bedroom window was locked from inside. On the pillow lay a single sheet of paper. The obituary was printed too soon. Inspector Harris arrived with Miss Marple. He examined the room and shook his head. No forced entry, no struggle, nothing. Miss Marple stood quietly beside the bed. She studied the note, then the locked window. "Mrs. Ashcombe wasn't taken," she said. Harris looked at her. "Then where is she?" Miss Marple's eyes moved toward the bedroom door. "That's what we must find out." A floorboard creaked somewhere downstairs. They both turned. Then came another sound, a door slowly closing. Chapter 2. The House of Secrets. The door downstairs had closed by itself. At least, that was what Inspector Harris wanted to believe. He and Miss Marple walked slowly along the corridor. The house was silent. The front door was locked, and every window was shut. Then Miss Marple noticed something beside the umbrella stand. A single wet footprint marked the polished floor. It was small, fresh. "Someone has been here," Harris said. Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, and they didn't come through the front door." They searched the drawing room. The obituary was still beside the fireplace, but someone had moved it. Miss Marple picked it up and noticed two faint numbers written on the back. 11:17. Harris stared at them. "A time?" he asked. "Perhaps," said Miss Marple, "though I suspect it's connected to something much older." In Eleanor's study, they found an old photograph of her late husband, Edward. He was standing beside Charles Wren, the family solicitor. Edward was holding a small envelope. Miss Marple turned the photograph over. A date had been written on the back. It was 2 days after Edward's supposed death. Harris frowned. "That makes no sense." Miss Marple looked at the photograph. "No, it makes something else." A sound came from the corridor. Daniel, Eleanor's nephew, stood in the doorway. His face was pale. "You shouldn't have found that," he whispered. Harris stepped forward. "Why?" Daniel looked at Miss Marple. "My aunt knew Edward hadn't died in an accident. She'd been investigating his death for years." Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "Did she know who killed him?" Daniel hesitated. "She believed the killer was still living in St. Mary Mead." The telephone suddenly rang. Harris answered it. For several seconds there was nothing but silence. Then a low voice said, "Tell Miss Marple to stop looking." The caller hung up. Harris slowly lowered the receiver. Miss Marple, however, seemed more interested in the photograph. She turned it over again. Beneath the date was a name neither of them had noticed before. Margaret Vale. Miss Marple's expression hardened. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I think we've just found the person who knows where Eleanor is." Chapter 3. The Truth Behind the Obituary. Margaret Vale arrived in St. Mary Mead shortly after 11 o'clock. She was a thin woman of 70, dressed in a dark wool coat that looked as though it had seen many winters. She carried a small black handbag and held it tightly against her chest. When she entered the police station and saw Miss Marple waiting, she stopped for a moment. "Eleanor isn't dead," she said. Miss Marple gave a quiet nod. "I know." Margaret looked surprised. "Then you must find her quickly. The man who wrote that obituary won't wait much longer." Inspector Harris closed the office door. Margaret sat down and began to speak. 20 years earlier, Edward Ashcombe hadn't died in a boating accident. He had been murdered. Eleanor had suspected it almost from the beginning, but she had never been able to prove anything. Edward had discovered that money was being stolen from his business. He'd planned to expose the people involved. Then, on a wet November evening, he died beside the river. His death was called an accident. The village accepted it. Eleanor never did. "For years she searched for proof," Margaret said. "She believed someone close to Edward had arranged his death." Harris asked who that person was. Margaret looked toward Miss Marple. "Charles Wren, the family solicitor." Harris frowned. Why didn't she accuse him? Margaret gave a tired smile. "Because suspicion isn't evidence, Inspector. Eleanor knew that." Miss Marple looked at the old photograph Margaret had brought with her. Edward Ashcombe stood outside the house beside Charles Wren. Edward was holding a small envelope. On the back was the number 1117. "What does that mean?" Harris asked. Margaret answered quietly. "That's when Edward's watch stopped." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "And where was Wren that evening?" "He always said he left Ashcombe House before 11. Miss Marple sat back. "Always?" Margaret nodded. "Then he may have repeated the same lie too often." They returned to Ashcombe House. Miss Marple went directly to Eleanor's bedroom. She studied the room again. The untouched bed, the dressing gown, the shoes beneath the chair. Nothing suggested a hurried escape. "She didn't leave with a suitcase," Harris said. "No coat, no handbag, nothing." Miss Marple smiled faintly. Exactly. Mrs. Ashcombe wanted us to believe she'd disappeared. She didn't necessarily want us to believe she'd gone far. She moved toward the wardrobe. Behind it, they found the narrow wooden panel. Harris stared. I've searched this house twice. Yes, and you searched it like a policeman. She opened the panel. Behind it was an old servant's passage covered with dust. Fresh marks crossed the floor. Miss Marple followed them to the library, where a loose floorboard concealed a small metal box. Inside were letters. The first was from Edward. The second was from Charles Wren. The third was from Eleanor. Miss Marple read Eleanor's letter slowly. It explained that Wren had visited her the previous night. He had demanded the evidence she had found. When she refused, he threatened her. Eleanor realized that she could no longer remain openly in the house. She had decided to disappear before Wren could make her disappear for good. Harris looked at Miss Marple. So the whole thing was staged. Yes, the obituary, the note, the missing woman, all designed to frighten the killer into making a mistake. There was a pause. Then Miss Marple looked toward the old linen cupboard. That door, she said. Harris opened it. Eleanor Ashcombe was sitting inside. She looked tired. Her hair was untidy and there were dark circles beneath her eyes, but she was alive. She looked at Miss Marple and gave a small, weary smile. I wondered when you'd find me. Harris stared at her. Mrs. Ashcombe, you had the entire police force searching for you. I'm sorry. You could have told us. I couldn't trust everyone. Miss Marple sat beside her. You suspected Charles Wren. I knew he was involved. Eleanor had discovered that Edward had discovered the theft of money from his company. Wren had helped hide it. When Edward threatened to expose him, Wren had arranged the meeting by the river. Edward never came home. His watch stopped at 11:17. Eleanor had spent 20 years looking for proof. She had finally found it, but Wren had discovered that she had found it too. So you wrote your own disappearance, Miss Marple said. Eleanor nodded. The obituary arrived yesterday morning. I knew what it meant. Someone wanted me dead. I decided to make them believe they'd succeeded. Miss Marple smiled. A dangerous plan. It was the only plan I had. There was still one thing missing, proof strong enough to put Wren away. Miss Marple examined the letters again. One envelope had a postmark. She held it close to the light. Inspector, Harris looked over. This letter was posted 3 days after Edward died. Harris frowned. That's impossible. Exactly. The handwriting belonged to Charles Wren. The letter placed him at the river after the time he claimed he'd left Ashcombe House. It also mentioned the meeting with Edward. There was no longer any doubt. Harris went to arrest him. Wren arrived at the police station that afternoon, still confident that he'd talked his way out of trouble. He became less confident when he saw Eleanor sitting beside Miss Marple. You, he whispered. Eleanor stood. You should have left me alone. Wren looked at Harris. This is absurd. Miss Marple had a nod. No, Mr. Wren, what's absurd is that you believed an obituary could frighten a woman who had spent 20 years living with the truth. Wren's face tightened. You wrote it, Miss Marple continued. You knew details that weren't public. You knew Edward's watch. You knew Eleanor was searching for the missing evidence. You wanted her to believe that you could reach her anywhere. I don't know what you're talking about. Perhaps not, but the letters do. Harris placed them on the table. Wren looked down. For several seconds he said nothing. Then his shoulders dropped. It wasn't a confession, not quite, but it was enough. Charles Wren was arrested for Edward Ashcombe's murder and for attempting to silence Eleanor. The case that had haunted Ashcombe House for 20 years was finally finished. Eleanor returned home 3 days later. Mrs. Pike cried when she saw her. Daniel apologized for every foolish thing he'd said during the investigation. Inspector Harris proudly announced that he'd suspected Wren from the beginning. Miss Marple looked at him. Harris cleared his throat. Well, perhaps not from the beginning. Quite. The village slowly returned to its ordinary routine. The baker opened at 7, the church bell rang at 8. Mrs. Bell complained about the price of butter. People went on living. That was the strange thing about villages. A murder could tear everything apart on Monday. By Friday, someone was complaining about the weather. Miss Marple was sitting beside her window one quiet morning when Mrs. Bell brought her the newspaper. She opened it while waiting for her tea to cool. Then she stopped. There, near the bottom of the page, was another obituary. Death announced. Name withheld. Miss Marple read the notice twice. There was no name, no address, only a date.
Tomorrow. She lowered the newspaper. Mrs. Bell noticed her expression. Bad news? I don't know yet. Miss Marple turned the paper over. A tiny mark had been written beneath the notice. 2 numbers, 1117, the same numbers that had appeared on Eleanor's obituary. Miss Marple became very still. Then the telephone rang. She answered it. For several seconds there was nothing but silence. Then a man's voice spoke. You solved the Ashcombe murder. Miss Marple said nothing. The voice continued. But you didn't solve the reason for the obituary. The line went dead. Miss Marple slowly placed the receiver down. Outside, a black motor car was parked across the road. It had been there for several minutes. Now it began to move. It passed the house slowly. Miss Marple watched it disappear around the corner. Then she looked at the newspaper again. For the first time since the case began, she understood something that made her uneasy. The Eleanor's obituary never was the real message. It was a test. Someone wanted to know whether Miss Marple would notice the clues, and she had. The second obituary was not a threat to Eleanor. It was a message to Miss Marple. Someone was telling her that another murder had already been planned. The only question was who would die at 11:17. Miss Marple folded the newspaper and placed it beside her teacup. She picked up her knitting. Her hands were perfectly steady. Well, she murmured, I suppose we'd better find them. And so the mystery of Eleanor Ashcombe came to an end. But for Miss Marple, the matter wasn't quite finished, not while another obituary was waiting to become true. If you've enjoyed this mystery, subscribe to Haunting Vales for more Miss Marple mysteries, atmospheric British village murders, hidden clues and unexpected twists. And if you enjoyed this case, leave a comment and tell us what you thought of the obituary. Did you suspect Charles Wren, or did he fool you until the end? There would be another case. There was always another case. And as Miss Marple sat quietly beside the window, the church clock began to move toward 11:17. The newspaper remained open on the table. The name was still missing, but somewhere in St. Mary Mead, a person was already living on borrowed time.